The auction hall was a vast space filled with bright floodlights that turned the sand-covered arena into a wide, shining stage. Horses walked in one after another, each bred from careful lines, each polished and groomed to show muscle and grace. Bids climbed into the hundreds of thousands as well-dressed buyers in tailored suits and felt hats watched with trained, calculating eyes. To them, this was not a show of animals but a matter of money and status, a place to pick the best investment. The auctioneer hit the polished podium with a practiced hammer, sealing deals that moved fortunes from one ledger to another. Then a chestnut stallion walked into the center of the ring, and everything changed. The horse was powerful, with a broad, rippling frame that shone under the lights, but the room's energy shifted the instant he stopped. Conversations fell away to whispers. The same eyes that had been sharp and assessing slid away from his form, and where curiosity had once been, there was now an uneasy silence. The stallion drew a slow breath, dark nostrils flaring with nervous energy. His deep brown eyes held something that many in the room missed at first, something that looked like sadness. The auctioneer cleared his throat, trying to move the pattern of the sale along. He announced the horse's pedigree and tried to get the first bid, his voice echoing into a sudden hush. No one moved. People whispered behind hands and exchanged small, judgmental shakes of the head. Two men in the front row exchanged a private joke and laughed under their breath. The stallion's ears flicked, his gaze moving across the sea of faces as if searching, and for a moment he simply stood, heavy with awareness of being judged and set aside. Seconds stretched and the silence seemed heavier than any earlier applause. The auctioneer forced another call for bids, steady on the surface but with a thread of doubt beneath the words. Then an older voice came from the back, calm and sure. Heads turned. The man was small in stature but carried a presence the room recognized not for wealth but for an honest, weathered life. He wore a faded plaid shirt, a cowboy hat softened by years, and a face mapped by lines from sun and wind. He was not there to impress anyone. The auctioneer paused, taken by surprise, then brought the gavel down and announced the stallion sold to the man with the white hat. The new owner moved slowly toward the horse, as if the stallion's presence demanded care rather than ceremony. A tightness settled in his chest that he could not explain. The air around him seemed to carry an odd chill, a sense that what he was taking on was more than an animal. The reins felt familiar in his hands. The stallion did not balk or buck. He simply watched the man with a long, quiet stare. When the man left the hall with the horse, he had no idea how deeply this night would change his life. Outside, the night wrapped around the county like a cool blanket. The auction grounds emptied quickly as wealthy buyers loaded horses into sleek trailers and drove off under starlit skies. The man's setup was humble by comparison, an old pickup and a sturdy trailer worn by years of honest work. The stallion studied the small campsite with cautious interest and then stepped into the trailer without drama. As the truck rolled down the country road, the rhythmic sound of hooves inside kept time with the miles. The new owner felt a tug at his chest as the horse's presence pressed against his memory like something just out of reach. It had been many years since he had stood in a barn at night and listened to a horse breathe beside him. Maybe that was why everything felt strange. Rust in the mind, a muscle unused for too long. When he arrived at his small ranch, the ground smelled of hay and earth and the night wind. He opened the trailer and expected the horse to be restless. Instead, the stallion moved down into the yard with steady, measured steps and took in his new surroundings. Led into an empty stall, the horse paused, tensed, and then, without a sign of fear, made a low, deep sound that was not a cry but the soft breath of recognition. He leaned his muzzle toward the man and pressed, gentle but sure, against his shoulder. The man stood frozen. The gesture felt familiar in a way that sent a shiver up through his ribs, like a missing piece of a puzzle slipping into place. Night settled over the farm, and for a long time the man sat on his porch watching the barn, thinking of the auction, of the way no one had wanted this horse. Why had such a well-bred animal been passed over? Why had he felt such a pull toward this particular animal? There was an unease in the chest that was not the kind that sleep could ease. Dawn came slow and painted the morning with gold and amber. Joints ached and memory tugged, yet the question remained sharper than the ache. The stallion stood in his stall when the man entered, ears pricked and eyes deep and steady as if he had expected this morning. As a brush was taken up and the horse's coat began to shine under the bristles, the stallion leaned into the touch and seemed to accept the routine with the ease of familiarity. Then, as the hand moved to his left flank, the horse flinched sharply. The man froze, parted the coat with careful fingers, and found a long, jagged scar cutting down the horse's side. It was an old wound but had been deep, the kind that spoke of violence and survival. The view of that scar knocked the air out of him, and a memory burst through like a sunlight against a fogged window. A younger self gripping reins as a powerful chestnut bolted across open fields, the rush of wind, a sudden crash of a broken fence, the bright red of blood on gold hair. It all came back so clearly that for a moment the barn and the world blurred. The realization hit like a physical blow. This horse was not merely similar to one lost so long ago. This horse was the horse that had been lost years before, the one he had been forced to leave behind and grieve. Neighs went weak. The barn seemed to lean in. The stallion's gaze met his with a steady calm that felt like recognition. Between man and animal, there was an unspoken ledger of shared pasts and old trust. For a beat, the two simply looked at each other and the years seemed to fold. There was no sensible explanation at first. It could be coincidence, a trick of memory, or a mistaken identification. But the horse leaned into the touch, closed his eyes for an instant, and allowed the hand upon his forehead. The touch answered the question without words. The man whispered the old name on a breath, and the animal shivered as if the name had been remembered too. Night passed with little sleep. The mind could not be shut off. Images came, galloping fields, quiet hours after a long day, the scream of metal and the nightmare of blood, and the helpless hour when a decision had been made to walk away. Now, with this horse in his barn breathing quietly in a stall, those images had lost their finality. If the stallion were the same, then the story behind the lost years had to be found. At first light, the decision was made. A thermos of coffee, a worn jacket, a steady hand on a halter. The horse watched closely and seemed to expect what came next. The first stop was the auction house. The place was quiet now, reduced to cleaning crews and leftover paperwork. The auctioneer was in his office, head bent over files. He looked up when the man entered, more puzzled than surprised to see him again. Questions came quickly. Where had the horse come from? The auctioneer shuffled papers and produced a thin packet that said the animal had arrived from a ranch a couple of counties over. The file was sparse and odd. The horse's condition was described only in broad strokes. He'd been through a lot, the paper read. Not suited for competition. No registration numbers, no sire or dam, no chain of ownership beyond the immediate sender. A weird wash of abandonment seemed to tint the little record, and it did not sit right with the man. How could a horse so built and so trained end up cast off? The auctioneer shrugged, not having much else to offer. The last ranch had simply wanted him gone. That was where the trail led, a place with sagging fences and an empty feeling. The drive was long. The open road allowed the mind to turn over possibilities. If the animal had been discarded, it was not because he was useless or untrained. The man had watched the horse move and felt the surety of his training in every stride. The truth began to form in his mind like a net drawing tight. Someone had wanted the animal out of the way. Back at the home ranch, the horse stood in the corral and watched with eyes that held a strange calm, as if everything was proceeding to form. The man took the halter, guided him out, and readied the saddle. The animal accepted it without fuss. When the man slid into the saddle and gave a light squeeze, the horse moved forward like a machine tuned to memory. The first canter across the fields clicked something into place. The movement, the response, The familiarity of shifts and weight made the man's mind gather itself around a single conclusion. This horse had been trained well, trained with care, and the energy behind him seemed to say he was waiting to be recognized. They rode on through wind that tugged at the mane and grass that bent under a steady pace until they reached an old oak tree standing sentinel on the edge of the property. The man dismounted and without thinking murmured a name, Blaze. At once the horse's ears pricked, tense and focused, every muscle tightened. There was that electric moment of recognition and the man's heart dropped and rose at once. The name fit. It unlocked something inside both of them. The horse pressed his head against the man's chest, as if to confirm a memory that had been buried. Emotions came like a river breaking a dam, wonder, relief, anger, and a raw determination. This raised a new set of questions in the man's mind. Who had taken Blaze? Who had left him to be shipped between ranches, unwanted and unlisted? If Blaze had been discarded on purpose, who would do such a thing and why? At dawn the man loaded Blaze and set off to find answers, guided by the thin trail left by auction records. The rural drive led to a place that felt abandoned even before the truck rolled into sight. Fences sagged, and a rusted truck sat like an old ghost near a faded barn. The man moved quietly across the property. Nothing stirred except the wind and the memory of broken boards. Inside the barn, dust floated in slanted shafts of morning light. Empty stalls gaped like open mouths. There were marks on the wood where a horse had pawed and fought to escape. The sight of those deep gouges made the man's jaw clench. It was easy to imagine Blaze trapped here, pushing and pushing until his body bore the mark of the effort. A voice called from the doorway, and the man turned to face someone who had been waiting. He was younger, rough around the edges, with a confidence that carried a hint of arrogance. The conversation that followed came slowly at first, then became a tight, dangerous thing. The young man admitted the horse had been left at that ranch to be disposed of, but he could not bring himself to do the deed. He had kept the animal, thinking he might find some other way, but the truth was messy. Someone had ordered Blaze gone. The man on the porch pushed, pressing for names. The young man's unease broke into a grudging truth: someone out west, a rancher with money and power who liked problems removed rather than explained. The name brought a chill when it was spoken. Before more could be uncovered, a truck arrived and the thrum of its engine made everyone freeze. Tires crunched on gravel, and a figure stepped from the truck with a presence that closed the room's air down into a tight fist. The man entering wore an old certainty like armor, a rancher named Clayton Monroe. He was known for strong pockets and for making difficulties go away without questions. The man's face cut into a smile that did not reach his eyes when he saw who stood before him. Exchange of words was small and acidic. Accusations were not needed because Clayton admitted what was already feared. He had paid for Blaze to be put down, had paid enough to make sure the ancient wound and the accident were not examined further, had wanted to erase the horse and the memory linked to him. The barn seemed to close in as these truths unfolded. Blaze's voice then rose from the stall with a snort that carried recognition and fury. He pinned his ears. He remembered the man who had once sat him, and for a blinding instant all of the past gathered into a single sharp point. The man did not wait for permission. He led Blaze through the barn door and out into daylight, feeling the warmth of the sun like a counter to the cold betrayal that had just been named. Clayton took a step back as if seeing a possible price on his actions for the first time. Words passed between them that were low and hard. The man did not need to be loud to be dangerous. He simply walked out, Blaze at his side, and left Clayton with the weight of what was known. The world narrowed down to the simple fact that Blaze had survived, that someone had wanted him dead, and that truth had been bought and paid for by a man with no patience for ties and no care for the life he tried to erase. The ride back felt like a passage from one life into another. Where grief had been, there now stood a raw, new purpose. There was no turning back to the old habit of quiet acceptance. The reunion had also become a call to action. The horse deserved better, and the man who had once walked away from his companion would not allow the rest of Blaze's life to be shaped by those who valued profit over loyalty. The day unfolded into plans for a recovery, for care, and for a slow rebuilding of trust in a world that had tried to steal it. The sun sank and rose, and the barn filled with the sounds of healing. Soft wickers, the scrape of a brush, the steady thump of a human heart learning to match the rhythm of another creature again. Questions remained. How many more bones were tied to this web? How deep did the conspiracy run? Who else had palms in the trade of erasing animals and people alike? But those questions would be answered one by one, with patience and a resolve as steady as a halter. In the quiet moments between work and the slow repair of both horse and man, the lesson was clear. Some bonds are not so easily broken, and some lives will not accept the lie of gone as final. Blaze had been hidden, used, then discarded, but he had survived, and survival had brought him home. The future now was about care, and about making certain that neither the horse nor the truth could be bought away again. For everyone who hears this kind of story and feels the pull of loyalty, the next step is simple. Stay with these tales and let them grow. If this story moved the heart, join the journey, subscribe to follow what comes next. Like to help others find this tale and share it to give Blaze and every lost companion a chance to be found and remembered.